There are 293 writing systems around the world, 156 of which are still used today, not including fantasy conlangs. But they didn't all pop up out of nowhere, as most actually would have developed out of a different script. In a previous video, I talked about how most of the writing systems used around the world today, including Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Cyrillic, Mongolian, and possibly even the scripts of South and Southeast Asia, all descend from a common ancestor, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. But Chinese doesn't, neither does the Maya script, nor even the cuneiform used across the ancient Middle East. So when you look at it like that, how many times have people independently come up with the idea of writing? And more importantly, how are we actually counting this? Previously on KhAnubis Talks About Writing Systems, a simplified form of Egyptian hieroglyphs called hieratic led to the development of Phoenician, which begat Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. Greek later begat Latin and Cyrillic, while Aramaic spread throughout the Persian Empire, inspiring Mongolian and Uyghur via Old Syriac, and possibly, though it's heavily debated, also Brahmi, which is the ancestor of all these scripts in India and Southeast Asia. Okay, you should be caught up on the gist of the backstory. Egyptian hieroglyphs might be the ancestor of all these writing systems, but it was not the first in the world to develop. That honor goes to cuneiform, which first showed up around 3500 to 3000 BC, during the late North Gryphian. And while cuneiform was used all across the Middle East in many different languages for over 3,000 years, it was of course Egyptian whose descendants would spread around the world. In the modern world, the biggest exception to the Egyptian Phoenician family is East Asia. The most obvious outlier, and indeed the most used, is Chinese characters, known as Hanzi, or Han characters, first being seen around 1200 BC. The final script people usually count when you ask this question on the internet is the Maya script, used all around the Yucatan Peninsula from the 3rd century BC up until Spanish colonization. Another system that developed around the same time as Egyptian and cuneiform is the Indus script of the Indus Valley civilization, which is also heavily debated to be the ancestor of Brahmi, and thus the scripts of South and Southeast Asia. This indigenous origin hypothesis is controversial and doesn't have as much evidence to support it, but it hasn't been completely ruled out. Because the surviving samples of the Indus script are usually quite short, it is often considered to be a kind of proto-writing, which is way older than writing, as in potentially 35,000 years older than cuneiform, and actually seems to be quite a lot more common around the world. In other words, it's actually quite common for cultures to develop proto-writing, but not as common for that proto-writing to become writing. Proto-writing is different from true writing in that it tends to rely on pictograms and ideograms. Think of emoji or street signs. They carry their own meaning, but they're not abstract enough to be used for a whole language, including things like people's names. A general rule of thumb is, a pictogram represents an object, an ideogram represents, well, an idea of an object, and a logogram represents an actual specific unit of language, or a morpheme if you want to be fancy. So if you want to be an actual writing system, your symbols need to represent words, not just objects. Chinese Hanzi is of course the most famous logography, but Egyptian, Maya, and cuneiform all worked similarly, though they were also at least a bit phonetically curious, coming to represent not just words, but also individual sounds. As Chinese characters spread across East Asia, a similar thing would actually happen. When they first spread to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, these symbols were used to write Chinese, as if they never left China, but over time came to be used for Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. In Vietnam, this is the main difference between Chu Han and Chu Nom. That's the quirk of logographies, since symbols don't actually represent sounds, but morphemes, so the same character can be used in multiple different languages. So why don't we write more languages in Chinese characters? Question. Well, because they were made with Chinese in mind. Statement. Which means they often get clunky in languages that aren't even related to Chinese, like Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese, which each come from their own completely separate language families. Japanese, for instance, has several grammatical particles that Chinese does not have. So one solution was to take these characters as they were pronounced in Chinese, or the Chinese of the time, and use them as phonetic substitutes, regardless of their actual meaning. Over time, Japanese scribes even began to simplify some of these characters into the syllabaries of hiragana and katakana, whose characters represent only consonant-vowel syllables, thus forming the building blocks of words. At the other end of Asia, a similar thing happened to cuneiform, which was also used for languages from vastly different families, but over time started to be used as a syllabary. Same with Egyptian hieroglyphs, which were largely logographic, but not entirely, as the symbol for an object was also often used for the first sound in the word for that object. So imagine using a symbol like this as the word for house and for the letter H. The Phoenicians of course took this a step further, going fully phonetic with their adaptation of Egyptian hieratic, which made them flexible enough to be used for almost any language with just a little bit of modification. Back in East Asia, and 2,000 years later, Korea threw this all completely out the window and started all over again from scratch, creating Hangul, which uses purely phonetic characters to build syllable blocks. But even though Hangul is its own unique thing that works completely differently from Chinese, you can still see the vague aesthetic inspiration, what with being organized in these blocks. So does Hangul count as part of this list? Another script to look at for this question, and because it's interesting, is Cherokee, developed by a man named Sequoyah in the 19th century. Sequoyah was raised in the Cherokee town of Tuskegee in Tennessee, but his father was an English fur trader. Later on, he would serve in the army, where he saw his fellow soldiers writing letters to their distant loved ones in English with their fancy Latin alphabet, and thought, wait, why can't we have that too? And so, over the next 10 years, he created a new unique script for the Cherokee language. The system he created might use some of the same designs as the Latin alphabet, but aside from these letters making completely different sounds to their Latin counterparts, the system was also a syllabary, like hiragana. So does the Cherokee syllabary count as its own thing, or is it a child of Latin? Cherokee may work as differently from Latin as Hangul does from Hanzi, but it's safe to say that if Latin and Hanzi never existed, neither would Cherokee or Hangul. And since the question of the video is how many times was writing invented rather than remixed, I'm going to count scripts like these as asterisks under the other ones. Or actually, I could also put them in their own category of invented scripts, since they were each invented by one person in places that already had writing. Similar thing goes for the syllabaries used for many indigenous languages across northern Canada, as well as constructed languages, or conlangs, like Elvish or Klingon or Valyrian, but that's a whole other thing. To be fair, I've made videos debating even less useful arguments. For one such useless debate, see my video on which landlocked countries are truly landlocked. And consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon if you enjoy videos like this. The question of this video is, how many times was writing invented? But the question of this chapter is, what do we mean by invented? Do I mean different people independently coming up with the idea of writing? As in, that's a lot of things to keep track of. I know, I'll draw some special markings on this rock. Surely no one's come up with that before. You youngins and your crazy startups. Back in my day, things were exactly the same. Because in the Bronze Age Middle East, there were also hieroglyphic systems used in Crete and in Anatolia. By the way, if you're wondering what the difference is between hieroglyphs and hieroglyphics, hieroglyphs usually refers to the symbols themselves, while hieroglyphics refers to the system as a whole. In other words, the Egyptians used a hieroglyphic system of hieroglyphs. It's kind of like saying Latin letters versus the Latin alphabet. It's a subtle difference, and you can honestly be forgiven for mixing up the two. You're mostly only going to be annoying nerds with deep special interests, but I have to be careful about that because that's most of my audience. On the island of Crete once lived the Minoan civilization, who also used a hieroglyphic system known as Cretan hieroglyphs. This system evolved into a kind of logosyllabary called Linear A, to modern archaeologists. They probably called it something different, but we don't really know because we don't know what the symbols mean, so we're stuck with these clinical scientific terms. Although, I have always found it fascinating when we refer to cultures by these scientific terms, like the bell beaker culture or the corded ware culture. One script from around this time and place that we have deciphered is Linear A's direct descendant. You'll never guess what it's called. You ready? Linear B. This syllabary system was used by the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, the precursor to who we think of as the ancient Greeks, or as I like to put it, the ancient Greeks. Linear B, however, faded out of use around the late Bronze Age collapse, along with Linear A, leaving Greece without a writing system until, according to Herodotus, the hero Cadmus introduced the Phoenician script, where it was modified to better fit the Greek language. I'm just telling the same story over and over again. There was also another script used by the Luwians of Anatolia, which also has been deciphered, known simply as Anatolian hieroglyphs. However, with cuneiform having been previously used throughout Anatolia, such as by the Hittite Empire, and the Minoans having had direct trade links with Egypt, is it possible that these civilizations got the idea of writing from one of the others? It is possible, but in the case of Crete, it seems much more likely that their hieroglyphs developed independently with maybe a vague Egyptian influence after they already had an established proto-script. From what I found in my research, this also seems to be more or less true with Anatolian hieroglyphs, as well as another script from this rough time and place, Proto-Elamite, as in the scripts seem to be very much independent, but would have been made by people who likely at least knew about the concept of writing, or at least could have known about the concept of writing. Now, did Egyptian hieroglyphs come from cuneiform? No. Did they come from the same kind of proto-writing? Maybe? Were the Egyptians influenced by the Sumerians to come up with their own writing system? Possibly, but it's hard to say. Personally, I think it's easier to count these two as completely separate, independently developed writing systems, though some people like to group them together. Also worth mentioning before I wrap up the video are the Burcsú scripts, a series of pictographs from the Sichuan Basin dating to the 5th century BC. In southeastern Nigeria, the Akoi people have also been using an ideographic script since the 5th century AD, known as Insibidi. In Ireland, you can also find stones with carvings that look like this, written in an alphabet called Ogham, though it was likely influenced by Latin, with some linguists even thinking it was supposed to be a cipher of Latin. Lastly, I should also mention the most famous undeciphered writing system, Rungo Rungo of Easter Island, /Rapa Nui, though it could also be another example of proto-writing. Unlike Minoan, of course, we know very much what the Rapa Nui language is like. It's an Eastern Polynesian language, closely related to Hawaiian, Tahitian, and Maori. In fact, it's still spoken on the island, they didn't die out or anything. The script, however, well, I'd say no dice, but clearly we've already landed a 1 when it comes to solving this script. What certainly doesn't help is how few samples we have to work with today. If you want to learn more about deciphering long-forgotten writing systems, I made an entire video about that, or you can watch the video I teased earlier. Or actually, here's an entire playlist of all the writing system-related videos I've made. You can probably tell I like any excuse to talk about this kind of stuff.